Book One, Sections 12 through 14 of King Cole. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. King Cole by Upton Sinclair. Book One, The Domain of King Cole. Section 12. On the evening of the same Sunday, Hal went to pay his promised call upon Mary Burke. She opened the front door of the cabin to let him in, and even by the dim rays of the little kerosene lamp there came to him an impression of cheerfulness. "Hello," she said, just as she had said it when he had slid down the mountain into the family wash. He followed her into the room, and saw that the impression he had got of cheerfulness came from Mary herself. How bright and fresh she looked! The old blue calico, which had not been entirely clean, was newly laundered now, and on the shoulder where the rent had been was a neat patch of unfaded blue. There being only 3 rooms in Mary's home, 2 of these necessarily bedrooms, she entertained her company in the kitchen. The room was bare, Hal saw; there was not even so much as a clock by way of ornament. The only charm the girl had been able to give to it, in preparation for company, was that of cleanness. The board floor had been newly sanded and scrubbed, the kitchen table also had been scrubbed, and the kettle on the stove, and the cracked teapot and bowls on the shelf. Mary's little brother and sister were in the room: Jenny, a dark-eyed, dark-haired little girl, frail, with a sad, rather frightened face, and Tommy, a round-headed youngster, like 1,000 other round-headed and freckle-faced boys. Both of them were now sitting very straight in their chairs, staring at the visitor with a certain resentment, he thought. He suspected that they had been included in the general scrubbing. Inasmuch as it had been uncertain just when the visitor would come, they must have been required to do this every night, and he could imagine family disturbances, with arguments possibly not altogether complimentary to Mary's new "feller." There seemed to be a certain uneasiness in the place. Mary did not invite her company to a seat, but stood irresolute, and after Hal had ventured a couple of friendly remarks to the children, she said abruptly, "Shall we be taking that walk we spoke of, Mr. Smith?" "Delighted," said Hal; and while she pinned on her hat before the broken mirror on the shelf, he smiled at the children and quoted 2 lines from his Harrigan song: "Oh, Mary Jane, come out in the lane, the moon is a-shinin' in the old pecan." Tommy and Jenny were too shy to answer, but Mary exclaimed, "'Tis in a tin can ye see it shinin' here." They went out. In the soft summer night it was pleasant to stroll under the moon, especially when they had come to the remoter parts of the village, where there were not so many weary people on doorsteps and children playing noisily. There were other young couples walking here, under the same moon. The hardest day's toil could not so sap their energies that they did not feel the spell of this soft summer night. Hal, being tired, was content to stroll and enjoy the stillness; but Mary Burke sought information about the mysterious young man she was with. "Ye've not worked long in coal mines, Mr. Smith?" she remarked. Hal was a trifle disconcerted. "How did you find that out?" "Ye don't look it, ye don't talk it, ye're not like anybody or anything around here. I don't know how to say it, but ye make me think more of the poetry books." Flattered as Hal was by this naïve confession, he did not want to talk of the mystery of himself. He took refuge in a question about the poetry books. "I've read some," said the girl. "More than ye'd have thought, perhaps." This with a flash of her defiance. He asked more questions, and learned that she, like the Greek boy Andy, had come under the influence of that disturbing American institution, the public school. She had learned to read, and the pretty young teacher had helped her, lending her books and magazines. Thus she had been given a key to a treasure house, a magic carpet on which to travel over the world. These similes Mary herself used, for the Arabian Nights had been one of the books that were loaned to her. On rainy days she would hide behind the sofa, reading at a spot where the light crept in, so that she might be safe from small brothers and sisters. Joe Smith had read these same books, it appeared, and this seemed remarkable to Mary, for books cost money and were hard to get. She explained how she had searched the camp for new magic carpets, finding a poetry book by Longfellow, and a book of American history, and a story called David Copperfield, and last and strangest of all, another story called Pride and Prejudice. A curious freak of fortune, the prim and sentimentally quivering Jane Austen in a coal camp in a far western wilderness, an adventure for Jane as well as for Mary. What had Mary made of it, Hal wondered? Had she reveled, shop-girl fashion, in scenes of pallid ease? He learned that what she had made of it was despair. This world outside, with its freedom and cleanness, its people living gracious and worthwhile lives, was not for her. She was chained to a scrub pail in a coal camp. Things had got so much worse since the death of her mother, she said. Her voice had become dull and hard. Hal thought that he had never heard a young voice express such hopelessness. "You've never been anywhere but here?" he asked. "I've been in 2 other camps," she said. "First the Gordon, and then East Run. But they're all alike." "But you've been down to the towns?" "Only for a day, once or twice a year. Once I was in Sheridan, and in a church I heard a lady sing." She stopped for a moment, lost in this memory. Then suddenly her voice changed, and he could imagine in the darkness that she had tossed her head defiantly. "I'll not be entertainin' company with my troubles. You know how tiresome that is when you hear it from somebody else, like my next door neighbor, Mrs. Zamboni. Do ye know her?" "No," said Hal. "The poor old lady has troubles enough, God knows. Her man's not much good. He's troubled with the drink. And she's got 11 childer, and that's too many for one woman. Don't ye think so?" She asked this with a naïveté which made Hal laugh. "Yes," he said, "I do." "Well, I think people'd help her more if she'd not complain so, and half of it in the Slavish language that a body can't understand." So Mary began to tell funny things about Mrs. Zamboni and her other polyglot neighbors, imitating their murdering of the Irish dialect. Hal thought her humor was naïve and delightful, and he led her on to more cheerful gossip during the remainder of their walk. Section 13. But then, as they were on their way home, tragedy fell upon them. Hearing a step behind them, Mary turned and looked. Then, catching Hal by the arm, she drew him into the shadows at the side, whispering to him to be silent. The bent figure of a man went past them, lurching from side to side. When he had turned and gone into the house, Mary said, "It's my father. He's ugly when he's like that." And Hal could hear her quick breathing in the darkness. So that was Mary's trouble, the difficulty in her home life to which she had referred at their first meeting. Hal understood many things in a flash: why her home was bare of ornament, and why she did not invite her company to sit down. He stood silent, not knowing what to say. Before he could find the word, Mary burst out, "Oh, how I hate O'Callahan, that sells the stuff to my father. His home with plenty to eat in it, and his wife dressin' in silk and goin' down to mass every Sunday, and thinkin' herself too good for a common miner's daughter. Sometimes I think I'd like to kill them both." "That wouldn't help much," Hal ventured. "No, I know. There'd only be some other one in his place. You got to do more than that, to change things here. You got to get after them that make money out of O'Callahan." So Mary's mind was groping for causes. Hal had thought her excitement was due to humiliation, or to fear of a scene of violence when she reached home, but she was thinking of the deeper aspects of this terrible drink problem. There was still enough unconscious snobbery in Hal Warner for him to be surprised at this phenomenon in a common miner's daughter, and so, as at their first meeting, his pity was turned to intellectual interest. "They'll stop the drink business altogether some day," he said. He had not known that he was a prohibitionist. He had become one suddenly. "Well," she answered, "they'd best stop it soon, if they don't want to be too late. 'Tis a sight to make your heart sick to see the young lads comin' home staggerin', too drunk even to fight." Hal had not had time to see much of this aspect of North Valley. "They sell to boys?" he asked. "Sure, who's to care? A boy's money's as good as a man's." "But I should think the company—" "The company lets the saloon building. That's all the company cares." "But they must care something about the efficiency of their hands." "Sure, there's plenty more where they come from. When you can't work, they fire ye, and that's all there is to it." "And is it so easy to get skilled men?" "It don't take much skill to get out coal. The skill is in keepin' your bones whole, and if you can stand breaking 'em, the company can stand it." They had come to the little cabin. Mary stood for a moment in silence. "I'm talkin' bitter again," she exclaimed suddenly, "and I promised ye me company manner. But things keep happenin' to set me off." And she turned abruptly and ran into the house. Hal stood for a moment, wondering if she would return; then, deciding that she had meant that as good night, he went slowly up the street. He fought against a mood of real depression, the first he had known since his coming to North Valley. He had managed so far to keep a certain degree of aloofness, that he might see this industrial world without prejudice; but tonight his pity for Mary had involved him more deeply. To be sure, he might be able to help her, to find her work in some less crushing environment; but his mind went on to the question, how many girls might there be in mining camps, young and eager, hungering for life, but crushed by poverty, and by the burden of the drink problem? A man walked past Hal, greeting him in the semi-darkness with a nod and a motion of the hand. It was the Reverend Spragg, the gentleman who was officially commissioned to combat the demon rum in North Valley. Hal had been to the little white church the Sunday before, and heard the Reverend Spragg preach a doctrinal sermon, in which the blood of the Lamb was liberally sprinkled, and the congregation heard where and how they were to receive compensation for the distresses they endured in this vale of tears. What a mockery it seemed! Once, indubitably, people had believed such doctrines; they had been willing to go to the stake for them. But now nobody went to the stake for them. On the contrary, the company compelled every worker to contribute out of his scanty earnings towards the preaching of them. How could the most ignorant of zealots confront such an arrangement without suspicion of his own piety? Somewhere at the head of the great dividend-paying machine that was called the General Fuel Company must be some devilish intelligence that had worked it all out, that had given the orders to its ecclesiastical staff: "We want the present, we leave you the future. We want the bodies, we leave you the souls. Teach them what you will about heaven, so long as you let us plunder them on earth." In accordance with this devil's programme, the Reverend Spragg might denounce the demon rum, but he said nothing about dividends based on the renting of rum shops, nor about local politicians maintained by company contributions plus the profits of wholesale liquor. He said nothing about the conclusions of modern hygiene concerning overwork as a cause of the craving for alcohol. The phrase "industrial drinking," it seemed, was not known in General Fuel Company theology. In fact, when you listened to such a sermon, you would never have guessed that the hearers of it had physical bodies at all. Certainly you would never have guessed that the preacher had a body, which was nourished by food produced by the overworked and undernourished wage slaves whom he taught. End of Section 13. Section 14. For the most part the victims of this system were cowed and spoke of their wrongs only in whispers. But there was one place in the camp, Hal found, where they could not keep silence, where their sense of outrage battled with their fear. This place was the solar plexus of the mine organism, the center of its nervous energies. To change the simile, it was the judgment seat, where the miner had sentence passed upon him, sentence either to plenty or to starvation and despair. This place was the tipple, where the coal that came out of the mine was weighed and recorded. Every digger, as he came from the cage, made for this spot. There was a bulletin board, and on it his number, and the record of the weights of the cars he had sent out that day. And every man, no matter how ignorant, had learned enough English to read those figures. Hal had gradually come to realize that here was the place of drama. Most of the men would look, and then, without a sound or glance about, would slouch off with drooping shoulders. Others would mumble to themselves, or, what amounted to the same thing, would mumble to one another in barbarous dialects. But about 1 in 5 could speak English, and scarcely an evening passed that some man did not break loose, shaking his fist at the sky or at the weigh boss behind the latter's back. He might gather a knot of fellow grumblers about him. It was to be noted that the camp marshal had the habit of being on hand at this hour. It was on one of these occasions that Hal first noticed Mike Sikoria, a grizzle-haired old Slovak who had spent 20 years in the mines of these regions. All the bitterness of all the wrongs of all these years welled up in old Mike as he shouted his score aloud. 19, 22, 24, 20? Is that my weight, mister? You want me to believe that's my weight? That's your weight, said the weigh boss, coldly. Well, by Judas, your scale is off, mister. Look at them cars. Them cars is big. You measure them cars, mister. 7 feet long, 3½ feet high, 4 feet wide, and you tell me them don't go but 20? You don't load them right, said the boss. Don't load them right, echoed the old miner. He became suddenly plaintive, as if more hurt than angered by such an insinuation. You know all the years I work, and you tell me I don't know a load? When I load a car, I load him like a miner. I don't load him like a Jap that don't know about a mine. I put it up. I chunk it up like a stack of hay. I load him square, like that. With gestures the old fellow was illustrating what he meant. See there? There's a ton on the top and a ton and a half on the bottom, and you tell me I get only 19, 20? That's your weight, said the boss, implacably. But mister, your scale is wrong. I tell you I used to get my weight. I used to get 45, 46 on them cars. Here's my buddy. Ask him if it ain't so. What is it, Bo? Said Bo, who was a Negro, though one could hardly be sure of this for the coal dust on him. I can't make a livin' no more, exclaimed the old Slovak, his voice trembling and his wizened dark eyes full of pleading. What you think I make? For 15 days, 50 cents. I pay board, and so help me God, mister, and I stand right here, I swear for God I make 50 cents. I dig the coal, and I ain't got no weight. I ain't got nothin'. Your scale is wrong. Get out, said the weigh boss, turning away. But mister, cried old Mike, following behind him and pouring his whole soul into his words. What is this life, mister? You work like a burro, and you don't get nothin' for it. You burn your own powder, $50 a day powder. What you think of that? Cross-cut, and you get nothing. Take the skip and a pillar, and you get nothing. Brush, and you get nothing. Here, by Judas, a poor man, going and working his body to the last point, and blood is run out. You starve me to death, I say. I have got to have something to eat, haven't I? And suddenly the boss whirled upon him. Get the hell out of here, he shouted. If you don't like it, get your time and quit. Shut your face, or I'll shut it for you. The old man quailed and fell silent. He stood for a moment more, biting his whiskered lips nervously. Then his shoulders sank together, and he turned and slunk off, followed by his negro helper. Section 14.